This is Goldberg's chapters 3 and 4. Yes. And those are on Dada and Surrealism. So we start off with I like how she writes it just because it feels almost like we're learning a story about what's going on between these. So we start with Dada in chapter 3, and that starts with cabarets. A main person that Goldberg talks about is Hugo Ball, as well as his future wife, Emmy Hennings. And so we start with kind of Dada starting with cabaret theater and how that kind of idea of having these like short things similar to variety shows was happening. And this is after futurism had already been kind of created, that these are in part kind of, it's different because it's a different part of the world. It's in Germany rather than in Italy or Russia. So it's a little different, but it's kind of the same idea of revolution or anarchy, which kind of we talk about in the foreword, in Goldberg's third foreword, but she describes the cabaret with Hugo Ball's kind of cabaret before Cabaret Voltaire. She says that on page 50, there was half-written manifestos and partly edited magazines that they were kind of having. They were satirical sketches based on everyday life. And then she goes on to talk about Frank Wedekind, who actually, which is interesting because she talks about how kind of provocative he was, and it's a little creepy now that we're looking at it now about how he was just masturbating on stage. But I think he wrote Frühlings Wochen, which is I think that's how it's called. But that Spring Awakening, he wrote Spring Awakening, but it was all about anti-bourgeois art scenes and fighting that in Dadaism. And she talks about how on page 52 it says taking up the cause of artists against the complacent public at large. So that's kind of how it started in Munich, and then his performance as a cutting edge against society. So again on 52. So we talk about that, and it's all about how it's kind of refuting expressionism, which I didn't really understand what exactly she was referring to as futurism. And so yeah, that was kind of, and it also talks about how Wedekind really didn't want to be called a futurist, or not a futurist, an expressionist, not a futurist. But then it goes on to talk about Ball again, about how in Kokoschka, I believe that's what, in kind of Munich, and going back and forth about how the history is. And then we finally go to Zurich, and it's Hugo Ball in Zurich, and he decides to start the Cabaret Voltaire, and that was after he actually had correspondence with Marinetti, which was interesting to me. And that was also, so the idea of Dadaism as well as Surrealism is kind of this like fighting in the audience, which I just was wondering about. It sounded as if they kind of like, what they were doing was they were kind of like advertising themselves as these like bourgeois things just so they could get this audience and lure them in, but then they would do these things to upset them. I believe that's what they were trying to say. That's one of my questions, is why was there so mad chaos? So it goes from Zurich, and that's when Zara gets involved at, during the Club Voltaire and kind of takes control from Hugo Ball and right, and I'm scared that I'm gonna say it weirdly. Um, it's I'm sorry, I'm trying to find it. Hulsenbeck, thank you. Okay, so Hulsenbeck. So they're like kind of the main proponents, and they create things like simultaneous poems and so forth. So it goes from Zurich, and then Zara wants it to become kind of more. He wants it to become a magazine. He wants to make it almost like a school of learning where Hulsenbeck and Ball are kind of like, we kind of like it as just performance because Ball specifically is performance based and a lot about theater. Um, but basically, it kind of turns from this improvised to an improvised to organized. And that's when we kind of see how it goes from Zurich to Berlin, and Berlin Dadaists are a lot different because it's more about kind of revolution. It's about and it has a lot to do with the fact that this is post-war, so this is post World War One. All of these movements. So it talks about Berlin and kind of goes into the ideas that were behind the Berlin because so there was media after that. There was Gallery Dada, and which that was another thing that I was wondering about because all of this Dada, all of these Dada movements seem to be very very fast and continued to like go really fast. Like Cabaret Voltaire was only 5 months, and then the Gallery Dada was 11 weeks before it closed. So there's a lot of performances about expressionism, and then it goes on to spread. But then we have Sarah, who after the Dada five, um, and the idea of Parisians wanting the Dada, but also wanting the Surrealist. So we have Opinier, I think that's how you say it. Ooh. And he's the one who coined it. Page 78, he coined Surrealism. And he says it's a tendency in art and artistic and literary faith protested against the realism of theater. And then I like this quote on page 80. Way he has created surrealism. And that's interesting. Okay, well, and then it became a school even though it didn't want to be a school at first. So yeah, um, that's it.